Welcome to the third session of week 6. This session, I'll be talking about images of Emperor Gojong and Sunjong in photography and print media. In 1884, King Gojong became the first Korean monarch to be photographed. This marked a break from traditional modes of portraiture, as well as the beginning of a new understanding of portrait images in Korean society. Photography had a clear advantage over paintings in reproducing and disseminating portrait images. It was notably more accurate, quicker, and more affordable than paintings, thus making portraiture accessible to a broad segment of society rather than just a small elite. Additionally, photography allowed for the faithful duplication of reality, which was considered to be especially important in depicting specific and unique appearances of individuals. Accessible media such as newspapers, textbooks, and commercial postcards played a crucial role in the dissemination of portraits, increasing their impact and influence. While traditional ajin, or royal portraits, were created to document the legacy of the Joseon royal family, portraits of King Gojong evolved to reflect his reformist policies aimed at achieving 문명개화, or cultural enlightenment, at the turn of the 20th century. Once limited in accessibility, these portraits began to represent Korea in international diplomatic contexts, taking on diverse forms and embodying various visions of the new Korean nation-state. King Gojong strategically employed his portraits not only to legitimize the e-monarchy within Korea, but also to represent the nation in international contexts. His portraits, spanning photographs, sketches, oil paintings, and prints from the 1880s to the 1890s, reflect his determination to engage with Western international politics and diplomatic practices through the embracement of modern visual communication. However, since many of Gojong's portraits were produced by foreign agents, his active role in the creation, selection, and interpretation of these images was somewhat limited. The first known portrait photograph of Gojong was taken by American Percival Lowell in 1884. Crown Prince Sunjong was also photographed for the first time on this occasion. Lowell was invited to Korea in 1884 for his assistance and contribution to the 1883 Korean diplomatic mission to the United States. He was granted an audience with the Korean king and the unprecedented opportunity to photograph him in the palace. While the production of traditional ajin required strenuous planning, intricate execution, and strict adherence to court protocol, Lowell's photograph was in no way in line with tradition. Gojong was photographed in front of an outdoor pavilion in a standing pose, rather than sitting on a throne as protocol. In addition to Lowell, it is thought that the Korean photographer Ji Eun-young was also granted the opportunity to photograph the king and crown prince on this occasion. After the signing of treaties with Western powers in the 1880s, more foreign guests were given opportunities to photograph and paint portraits of Gojong, who welcomed such opportunities that could strengthen diplomatic ties with Western nations while also increasing Korea's presence abroad. Gojong's reliance on foreigners' portrait production continued from the 1880s throughout the 1910s. Korean photographers began to emerge after private trade with Japan was legalized in 1882, which facilitated the import of cameras and related equipment. The government also alleviated tariffs on their import in cases where it was thought to benefit the nation-state. Many of Korea's first generation of photographers were state officials or otherwise closely affiliated to the court, who had the chance to learn photography while performing official duties. Gojong actively supported the development of Korean photography, granting opportunities for local photographers such as Ji Eun-young and Kim Gyu-jin to capture his image. However, as mentioned in previous sessions, photography was viewed as a threat in the 1880s, and many photo studios were destroyed following the 1884 Capshin coup. It was not until 1900 that public fear of foreign technology diminished and photography became more accessible. Gojong remained dependent on foreigners in having himself represented in modern visual media throughout his reign, but he displayed an awareness of how foreign monarchs and officials were portrayed in modern portraiture. In 1876, he sent a survey team to Japan where they had their photographs taken and gathered images of modern infrastructure. A subsequent survey team in 1881 collected photographic portraits of Japanese officials and the monarchs and aristocrats of various Western nations. These photographs informed Kojong about the general methods of depicting monarchs in modern portraits. However, Kojong did not adhere strictly to either Western or traditional Joseon styles in his portraits and continued to use both styles for different occasions. He also allowed a degree of freedom to foreign artists and photographers. This resulted in numerous cases in which Kojong was represented through the foreign gaze, often characterized by the lack of charisma or an emphasis on Oriental exoticism. One notable example is a widely reproduced photograph of Kojong in his new Commander-in-Chief uniform taken by Murakami Tenshin around 1900. While this portrait of Emperor Kojong and Crown Prince Sunjong showed Kojong's attempt to embrace Western visual representation through his new and modern attire, the image lacks a sense of self-determination, as evidenced from his awkward posture and weak and wavering gaze into the camera lens. The photograph comes across as a commodified souvenir targeted toward foreign visitors rather than a royal portrait. Nevertheless, it would be unfair to dismiss Kojong's efforts to assert his own interests and politicize his image. The Korean court invested significantly in purchasing Western military uniforms for both Kojong and his son Sunjong, indicating the importance placed on visual presentation and image production by the emperor and his government. In 1899, the establishment of the Board of Marshals led to the formal adoption of Western military attire, with substantial funds allocated for uniforms and accessories. The fact that Kojong deliberately and frequently had Sunjong photographed alongside him also attests to his determination to have his legitimacy and lineage as a monarch of Korea visually and publicly represented in order to ensure both the country and his own survival in the rapidly changing world. Kojong also used his portraits to counterbalance external influence over the Korean peninsula. The Japanese victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, the assassination of Queen Min in 1895, and the subsequent proclamation of the Korean Empire in 1897 marked a significant increase in Japanese influence over the Korean peninsula. In order to curb Japan's growing power and the associated threats to Korean sovereignty, Kojong placed further importance on garnering amiable relationships with Western nations and their representatives. For instance, shortly after Kojong returned to the palace in 1897, Isabella Bird Bishop, a frequent guest of the late Queen Min, requested to photograph Kojong for Queen Victoria. Despite still being in mourning, Kojong agreed and even changed from his mourning attire to his royal robe for the occasion. While the original photographs are no longer extant, Bishop's book, Korea and Her Neighbors, features an illustrated portrait of Kojong, likely based on her photograph. This interaction highlights the growing significance of how Kojong presented himself in portraits, reflecting the increasing need to assert Korean sovereignty and power on the international stage. Another significant portrait, taken in 1905 by Kim Gyu-jin, was presented to Alice Lee Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of US President Theodore Roosevelt, for similar interests. The tinted photograph depicted Kojong in traditional imperial attire against the backdrop of court folding screens, signifying a blend of traditional and modern presentation. This photograph was noteworthy not only as one of the earliest taken by a Korean photographer, but also as an official portrait given to a diplomatic guest. The choice to employ a Korean photographer for this diplomatic portrait reflects the growing influence of photography in Korea and Kojong's increased comfort and confidence in controlling how he was represented. Compared to earlier images taken by foreign artists and photographers, this portrait aligns more closely with traditional Odin styles. Kojong continued to navigate between traditional and Western attire depending on the context and the image he sought to convey. Although he could not control how Western viewers would interpret his portrait, for the official portrait presented to the US, he aimed to assert his authority through the use of a full frontal pose, an elaborate yellow imperial robe, and decorative screens. Unfortunately, Kojong's agency in the production and consumption of his own portrait image was severely restricted after his forced abdication in 1907 and consequent annexation of Korea in 1910. As I mentioned in earlier weeks, traditional royal portraits were never shown to the public. The creation and preservation of the king's portrait was regarded as a major event in the Joseon court. It was customary to establish a dogam, or a temporary supervisory body, responsible for planning and organizing all aspects of the portrait's production. This included decisions on how the portrait would be made, the number of painters involved, the specific roles in the various stages of the process, as well as minute details of production, such as the selection of background, colors, and poses. Additionally, enshrinement and ceremonial processions were an essential part of portrait production, with the completed portraits being securely stored and used exclusively for palace rituals. In the 1890s, a pivotal change took place wherein Gojong's portraits were made publicly available to the Korean public. Gojong's portrait was first openly distributed in Korea during his stay at the Russian legation from 1896 to 1897, a time when he relied on the loyalty of American allies like Horace Grant Underwood and Homer Hulbert for protection after the assassination of Queen Min. In appreciation, Underwood received a photograph of Gojong in a white mourning robe taken at the legation. An almost identical photograph, captured by an amateur photographer, Mrs. L.B. Graham, appeared in the Korean Repository in November 1896, with Gojong's full approval. In 1897, Underwood's newspaper, Kristo Shinmun, offered its readers photolithographs of Gojong, initially intended for sale, but later provided as subscription gifts due to high demand. Although the original image is yet to be identified, Lilias Horton Underwood's book contains a depiction of Gojong that matches the description of the photolithograph. The accessibility of this image was enhanced by its publication in Hangul, making it a significant opportunity for the public to obtain a portrait of their monarch for the first time since the founding of Joseon. The dissemination of this image clearly illustrated the strong demand for Gojong's portrait during this period. From the late 1890s until 1905, royal portraits of Gojong were actively produced and disseminated in Korea, reflecting his increased confidence in being represented through various media. This period saw concerted effort to project Gojong as a newly elevated emperor amid rising domestic support for a constitutional monarchy and growing foreign threats to Korean sovereignty. From the onset of the 20th century, his image was gradually commercialized and sold as commodities. While this process desacralized and demystified Gojong's image, it helped bridge the gap between the monarch and the public, fostering greater allegiance to the nation-state. The production of painted portraits also continued, but was equally impacted by photography and began to be reproduced outside of the court. The original official Ojin of Gojong, commissioned in 1901 and 1902, are now lost, but a later replica by Choi Yong-shin survives as one of the few high-quality paintings resembling Gojong's official Ojin. This work combines Western painting techniques with traditional Ojin elements, and the rendering of facial features and the use of light suggests the reference of a photographic image. However, elements such as the posture, composition, throne, and carpet retain traditional characteristics, a typical trait of the hybrid style of early 20th century portraits. Notably, Choi Yong-shin is known to have used a chobon, a primary template of the Ojin commissioned to him by Gojong. It seems that he was permitted to keep the chobon, which allowed for the reproduction of multiple replicas throughout the early 20th century. This marked a departure from traditional practices where the monarch's image was never reproduced outside of the palace. While Hubert Voss was allowed to take a copy of Gojong's portrait in oil for diplomatic purposes, Choi Yong-shin's case indicates a pivotal shift in how the king's image was treated, transforming from a sacred symbol into a public representation of national leadership. As more photographers and publishers emerged by 1910, Gojong's portraits gradually became further popularized and commodified. Before this commercial expansion, printed illustrations of both Gojong and Sunjong appeared in the 1908 history textbooks, such as 초등 대한 역사, providing the public with access to their portrait images. Print was a cheaper alternative to photographs that was still expensive for many. This growing dissemination of Gojong's likeness through both photographs and print illustrations greatly contributed to forging a personal connection between the public and their ruler, who had historically remained hidden from public view throughout the Joseon period. Prior to his enthronement in 1907, Sunjong, Gojong's son and successor, had several portraits made as crown prince, including both traditional painted ojin and photographs. He was first photographed during Gojong's meeting with Percival Lowell in 1884 and also appeared alongside Gojong in an 1896 photograph. An official yejin, a painted portrait of the crown prince, was produced in 1902. After Gojong's forced abdication in 1907, Japanese officials sought to reshape Sunjong's public image to promote the narrative of a peaceful transition of power and mitigate growing tensions surrounding the possible Japanese occupation of Korea. Postcards featuring Sunjong's image were frequently produced for this purpose and were sold as commemorative souvenirs for notable events such as the 1907 Gyeongsang Exposition. Japanese authorities began to routinely use Sunjong's portraits toward and after annexation. In 1908, a photo album that commemorated Sunjong's first birthday after ascending the throne was published. This album included photographs of the birthday celebration and courtly events, but albums like these were expensive and primarily reserved for officials and foreign representatives rather than the general public. In contrast, postcards were more accessible alternatives. Sunjong's image began to appear prominently on postcards from 1907 when a series of photo postcards were released to celebrate his accession and the visit of Japanese Crown Prince Yoshihito to Korea, to promote a new Korea-Japan relationship and mitigate existing prejudices against Japan. Although this postcard superficially celebrated the supposedly amiable relationship between the two countries, subtle points such as the contrast between Sunjong's open-mouthed, awkward gaze and slightly tilted crown versus Prince Yoshihito's confident, full-frontal pose and the rich decoration of medals on his ceremonial uniform was telling of the power imbalance between the two national representatives. Compared to his father, Sunjong was frequently visually exposed, both in print media and in-person public appearances. Japanese colonial interests were increasingly reflected in Sunjong's portrait images toward annexation. In early 1909, Ito Hirobumi, the first resident general, orchestrated national tours to further publicize Sunjong and increase his visibility beyond the capital. These tours imitated Japanese Emperor Meiji's earlier nation-building efforts. Photographs taken during this tour documented Sunjong alongside Ito and other Japanese and pro-Japanese Korean officials. These images highlighted the attempt to use Sunjong's popularity among the Korean public while simultaneously reinforcing Japanese authority over Korea. Following annexation, a clear hierarchy of power emerged as the portraits of both Gojong and Sunjong were integrated into the visual symbolisms of the Japanese Empire. This integration involved the complete assimilation of Korean royal portraits into Japanese iconography, effectively representing Korea as a new colony of Japan. One method of this incorporation was through family tree portraits of the Lee royal family. These images served to recontextualize Gojong and Sunjong within the framework of Meiji imperial symbolism, diminishing their inherent status as monarchs of an independent nation-state. The portrayal of the Lee family as a decorative and nominal entity, stripped of any sovereign authority, reduced the Korean monarchy to a mere sub-branch of the Japanese imperial family. In this session, we focused on photographic images of both Gojong and Sunjong and their dissemination through modern print technology. In the next session, let's talk more about the consumption of popular photographic images and print media in the early 20th century.